Welcome to our internet discussion under the title, "What is your position on international law, Mrs. Merkel?" I would like to wish you a happy new year. And I would like to just introduce some facts before moving into the discussion. On December 8th, in the German weekly Die Zeit, there was a lengthy interview with former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in which she also spoke of the Minsk Agreement, an agreement that was supposed to begin the peace process for Ukraine in 2014. Ukrainian President Poroshenko and Russian President Putin had agreed on this and had met in Minsk on September 19th, 2014. Initially, they called for withdrawal of all weapons and the creation of a security zone for the Donbass, for the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. And then on February 12th, 2015, the so-called trilateral contact group of Ukraine, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, signed a comprehensive package of measures. Presidents Poroshenko, Putin, Hollande of France, and Chancellor Merkel became the guarantors of this accord. Then in July 2015, the Minsk Agreement and the support guarantee were adopted in the UN Security Council as Resolution 2002, unanimously. And about 8 years later, Mrs. Merkel now says the following in her interview in the Zeit. The Minsk Agreement 2014 was an attempt to give Ukraine time. It also used this time to become stronger, as can be seen today. Ukraine of 2014 and 15 is not the Ukraine of today. It was clear to all of us that the conflict was frozen and the problem was not solved, but that is exactly what gave Ukraine valuable time. Now, Putin was then asked about this at a press conference in Bishkek on December 9th, and he said, "Frankly, this was a complete surprise to me. This is disappointing." And as it turns out, nobody wanted to honor these Minsk agreements. The Ukrainian leadership had mentioned this as well, but I still hoped that the other participants would be sincere with us, said Putin. It seems they also deceived us. The only purpose was to pump weapons into Ukraine and get it prepared for hostilities. Trust as such is already close to zero, but after such statements, the question of trust becomes primary. How can we negotiate at all? What can we agree on? Putin said. Then French President Hollande said in an interview with the Kiev Independent newspaper on December 28th, yes, Angela Merkel is right on this point. Since 2014, Ukraine has strengthened its military position. In fact, the Ukrainian army was completely different from the one of 2014. And it was the merit of the Minsk agreements to have given the Ukrainian army this opportunity. So much for the introduction. So what does this mean for us today, 8 years later, when there is the conflict is fully waging? And what does this mean for German Chancellor Scholz and the others? And we have the confrontation between the greatest nuclear powers on the earth. So what does this mean for our future? We're going to discuss this, and we've invited some highly competent guests to do so. And I will reduce each of them before they speak. Afterwards, the people who are invited will have time to comment on the contributions made by the others and to follow up on them. And then, of course, we have ample time to take discussions from the audience. You can either ask your question directly in the chat if you're on Zoom, or if you're watching by live stream, send an email. The email address is fragen@Schiller -institute.de. Schiller institute without an E. So first I would like to ask Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, who's also the president of the civil rights movement Solidarity, for her. I greet you all very heartily. I'm going to talk about the subject, how many seconds to 12 do we have on the nuclear war clock? The reason that I called for this conference is because the population in the German-speaking countries are part of an international mobilization to find an immediate diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine. And what most citizens don't realize is that what is being hidden from them by the conformist or the mainstream mass media. We are in an existential danger where the fuse to the third thermonuclear war is already burning. Even the Spiegel, a magazine here in Germany that received its license from the British, wrote that the decision of Chancellor Scholz to deliver 4 Marder tanks to Ukraine has made Germany a war party to the war. And according to D-Radio, people in Ukraine are pretty sure that the Leopard 2 main battle tank will soon follow in the short term. The Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Melnik, is demanding warships, submarines, missiles, and the defense minister is also asking for more weapons from NATO. On TNS TV in early January, he had said, "Today, Ukraine is responding to this threat. We carry out NATO's mission without shedding its blood. We are shedding our blood, so we expect them to give us the weapons to do so." The next goal is to take back Crimea, which is an absolute red line for Russia, for which the former commander-in-chief of U.S. forces, Ben Hodges, he wants to destroy the supply routes going there, such as the Kerch Bridge and the land route via Mariupol. Spokesmen for the Ukrainian government are talking openly about plans to expel the 800,000 Russian-speaking residents from Crimea. So we've reached a point of total confrontation, and due to a long chain of events, Russia is convinced that there is no one in the West worth negotiating with, and that the decision will have to be made on the battlefield. NATO's line is that Ukraine must win in any case, even if the entire population is destroyed and the whole country is razed to the ground. The Ukrainian ambassador in London, Vadim Pristaiko, said so quite openly to Newsweek. He said, "We've been at war for almost a year now. We're losing people right and left. We don't publicize how many are military or civilians, but the numbers are enormous, huge. The West has a unique opportunity now. There are not many nations in the world willing to sacrifice so many lives, territories, and decades of development for the purpose of defeating the arch enemy." With these two positions, a decision on the battlefield, the instrumentalization of Ukraine to ruin Russia, As Annalena Baerbock, German foreign minister, says, the imminent nuclear catastrophe is pre-programmed. If Russia really does have, as Medvedev said, has really placed Zircon missiles with a supersonic speed of Mach 9 off the coast of NATO countries since the beginning of the year, then we are potentially just before Armageddon within less than 10 minutes. That has been vividly depicted by nuclear weapons expert Stephen Starr in a video that shows how a nuclear war would play out. And that video should be distributed worldwide so that every citizen on the earth learns about what would happen. Now, Mrs. Merkel said in December 2022 in interviews to Spiegel and Zeit that the 2014 and 15 Minsk agreements should never have served to pacify the conflict in Ukraine, in the Donbas, but only its own sole purpose was to gain time for rearmament and strengthening Ukraine for the ultimately inevitable war with Russia. And that was has since been confirmed by former French President Hollande. And former Ukrainian President Poroshenko had already said the same thing. So the implication of Merkel's assertion is outrageous. If it is true, then all the statements made by her and by all the other EU leaders, by the United States, and so on, have been lies from the very beginning. For example, on September 9th, Merkel said to the Bundestag, in recent months, we have always and repeatedly advocated that the crisis in Ukraine can be resolved diplomatically. The goal here is that Ukraine's territorial integrity be restored. The Minsk package of measures was adopted in February, and it remains the guiding principle on this path. I can tell you that the federal government, the federal foreign minister, and I, together with the French foreign minister and the French president, will continue to monitor and to make efforts, including in the Normandy format, to advance this the process, which has now entered a decisive political phase with regard to constitutional changes and local elections. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're not going to let up in our efforts because we see that this is the only path, the diplomatic path is the only one that we should go down. Then on November 23rd, 2016 in Berlin, Merkel said to the German Bundestag, we have to state in connection with Crimea and Ukraine the breach of international law and the violation of the territorial integrity of a country. Unfortunately, our talks on the implementation of the Minsk agreements have not yet progressed as far as I would like. Then on November 29th, 2018 in Berlin, Madame Merkel also said, I will raise the issue with the Russian president at the G20 summit. We will take care of it. Nevertheless, we have the request to be smart on the Ukrainian side as well, because we know that after all, we can only solve things reasonably and only by talking to each other. There are no military solutions to all these disputes. Somewhat later at the Munich Security Council in 2019, on February 23rd, Mrs. Merkel said, in 2014, there was the annexation of Crimea in March, which was clearly illegal behavior under international law. And then Petro Poroshenko, there was a laborious negotiated ceasefire, fragile, so to speak, but it was kept stable by the Minsk Agreement, with which Germany and France, together with Russia and Ukraine, are attempting to resolve the conflict. However, we have to say that we are far from a solution and we need to keep on working. So over the past 8 years, all political leaders have repeatedly stressed not only that the implementation of the Minsk agreements is official Western policy, without the two responsible countries, although the two responsible countries, that is Germany and France, have done nothing to persuade the Ukrainian government to implement them. And it also shows that the lifting of the sanctions against Russia would depend on the successful implementation of the Minsk agreements. So if what Merkel said last December is true, then the 9 sanctions packages that the EU adopted over the past years, and which were intended to strangle Russia step by step, or ruin Russia, as Mrs. Baerbock said, they were part of the long preparation for war. And French journalist from the Figaro, Georges Malbruno, reported in an interview with CNN News in April 2022 that he had seen that the United States was already in charge of the Ukrainian army at that time. So in his Christmas address, Vladimir Putin addressed the comments, the revelations made by Merkel and Hollande, and he said that it meant, what this showed is that Russia should have started its special military operation much earlier, because confidence was now pretty much at zero. And in spite of or in view of the shambles caused by Merkel's remarks, the question is, have all those responsible been lying all along? Or has Mrs. Merkel, who has recently been severely attacked for her earlier policy toward Russia, now saying all this just to kind of cover herself up, because the preparation for war has entered its final phase, and even the smallest concession of having once seen Russia as a partner must be buried, even the last illusion. And Mrs. Merkel would rather go down in history as a politician, if there still will be one, belonging to the Pompeo school of politics. We lie, we cheat, as he said. And in the same way, the current government has justified the end of Nord Stream 2 by saying Russia broke the Minsk Agreement. So perhaps the deafening silence on the perpetrators of the sabotage of Nord Stream 2 is related to the fact that people, and especially, that people become speechless when they fear that every word implicates them in the crime. So the official mantra imposed by the threat of punishment from the EU, if the EU, also includes speaking only of Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. Whoever dares to claim that the conflict in Ukraine has a prehistory, starting with the insistence on a unipolar world order after the end of the Soviet Union, the 5 NATO enlargements to the east, and above all, the Maidan coup in 2014, which was supported by the West, they are all denounced as a Putin agent or put on some lists. Some of the victims of which have already died. There is really an urgent need to publish the chronology of the people who have warned over the last 32 years where this policy toward Russia would lead, including George Kennan. I can only recommend that you read the interview that the originally absolutely pro-Western former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Azarov, gave in 2016 on the 3rd anniversary of the Maidan coup. In this interview, he went into detail about how the US and Europe had supported the coup on the Maidan, and extremely importantly, he said that any peaceful solution to the conflict must begin by acknowledging that it was a coup d'etat in February 2014. And for that, there is irrefutable documentation. So at this late stage, at just seconds to 12, if we are to find a way out of this crisis, then we need widespread, overwhelming publicity to be given worldwide to the demand for a diplomatic solution. Pope Francis has offered that the Vatican's premises be used as a venue for unconditional negotiations, and that is the best option so far. Other proposals have been made, such as from President Lula of Brazil and other countries of the global south. President Erdogan has made efforts from Turkey, and they could be coalesced around the Vatican's initiative. And I would ask all of you in that respect to sign our open letter from the Latin American Parliamentarians Initiative to the Pope. The Pope. I know that many military leaders in Russia and France and elsewhere they believe that it's too late for this to happen, it won't work, and that only military means will decide the outcome. I think that the risk is too great. It can quickly lead to a global nuclear war, the outcome of which no one will be around to discuss. Instead, what we need is a new international security and development architecture that takes into account the interests of every country, including Ukraine, Russia, China, and all others. To this end, I have introduced 10 principles into the discussion, which I would ask all of you to read and to discuss. The main idea of the 10 is that we as human beings are the creative species in the universe, and therefore we are able to find the higher level of reason on which any problem can be solved. The first step must be to accept Pope Francis's offer, and a worldwide chorus of voices be raised to demand that negotiations begin immediately in Rome with no preconditions. Yesterday, President Putin said that Russia is open to negotiations. However, that we must take into account with whom one is dealing. As I said, we're facing a shambles of international trust. That is why we need the worldwide mobilization of all people of goodwill to join in our chorus. Thank you. Thank you very much for your vibrant call, which I hope everyone will be able to join in. I would now like to ask Scott Ritter to intervene, and I would ask Mr. McGovern to be patient for a moment. He's a former intelligence of the U.S. Marine Corps and a former UN weapons inspector. And he was well known in this role as for the UN. So, Mr. Ritter, Scott Ritter, if you're there, you can now take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Helga, for your inspiring words of introduction. You know, in a perfect world, I think, you know, such an outcome as Helga is seeking, you know, is not only could be possible, but would be possible and would be desirable. But we don't live in a perfect world, and I'm in a position where I've lost confidence in the West to behave as a responsible partner for peace. And it's not just a lack of confidence with the institutions of government, but frankly speaking, I've lost confidence in the Western people, whom have become so enthralled with their consumer-driven lifestyles that they forgive virtually every sin committed by their governments, to include the sin of lying, deceit, not only of others, but the people themselves. But as long as the government aspires to have low energy prices, affordable food, and a modicum of comfort, all is forgiven. And we see that when it comes to the West's approach towards Russia, where every lie is accepted at face value. Every distortion of truth is accepted at face value. Every violation of trust is accepted as business as usual, where the Russians are demonized to the point where a nation of 158 plus million people has been personified into the body of one individual, Vladimir Putin, whom the West doesn't even know how to define properly. The West is incapable of putting Putin in a proper historical context, incapable of appreciating him as a product of modern Russian society, and as such, incapable of dealing with him responsibly when it comes to solving the problems that we are confronting in the world today. Only Angela Merkel can answer the question, is she a liar today, or has she always been a liar? But the bottom line is she's a liar. And, there's a principle in American jurisprudence, one lie, all lie. Once she has committed herself as a liar, she can never be trusted. And the same thing with the French, and the same thing with the United States, the same thing with the collective West. So we are asking Russia to deal with liars, to put their national security interests on the line in the hopes that liars will no longer lie. And that's just an irresponsible and unrealistic proposition from the Russian perspective. I know that we in the West would like it to happen, but what we're saying is we have failed, and therefore we are totally dependent upon Russian goodwill to save the day, for the Russians to come to the table and forgive everything and assume good faith, assume good intent. And I don't believe Russia can do that, nor do I believe Russia is willing to do that. In fact, I believe Russia is taking the exact opposite track, that the West, as it currently is configured, cannot be trusted, and that Russia has embraced a policy direction that is reflective of statements made by senior Western officials, including the Secretary General of NATO, that have said the situation in Ukraine will be resolved on the battlefield. Russia agrees. The situation will be resolved on the battlefield. The best the West can hope for, is that when Russia seeks to convene a gathering, which I believe will mirror what the gathering that took place in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945, one that transpired on the decks of the battleship Missouri, where a defeated Japanese enemy was given the opportunity to sign documents of unconditional surrender or die. So Russia will give Ukraine the opportunity to sign documents of unconditional surrender or die. The best the West can hope for is an early intervention where Russia can be convinced that it's in their best interest to offer these terms sooner rather than later. But this again will be done on a timetable dictated by Russia. And what that point will be, the pause point where Russia is willing to stop the trajectory of military victory and instead provide the possibility of unconditional surrender. Only Russia can make that determination. The West no longer has a vote. The West no longer deserves a vote. The West no longer should have a vote. The West no longer counts. The only party that matters today when it comes to resolving the Ukrainian conflict is Russia. And so therefore, I think it's incumbent upon us to work with the Russians to send a signal to the Russians that we trust in their humanity. We trust in their maturity as a nation. We trust in the maturity of their leadership, that they will not overplay their hand, that they will do that which is necessary to secure peace and security on Russian terms. And let's remember that Russian terms are not terms that the West cannot live with. Russia has already defined its terms. In December 17th of 2021, they provided 2 draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which they laid out in great detail the conditions under which they would like to see Russia and the West define a new European security framework. One that did not require NATO to disband, one that did not require any surrender on the part of the West, one that simply required the West to respect Russia's legitimate national security interests in the same way that Russia would respect the West's legitimate national security interests. I believe if the West signals to Russia that such terms would be acceptable in a post-Ukraine conflict environment, that is the foundation, that is the basis of a future negotiation. I'm not saying that the notion of the Vatican's intervention is flawed and should be forgotten. I'm just saying that the timing is not right. Maybe the Vatican can be that theater of neutrality where a new European security framework can be hammered out between a victorious Russia and a defeated West. But there will be no chance for any intervention at this stage, so long as the cancer that has become Ukraine, the cancer created by the West, armed by the West, motivated by the West, until that cancer has been excised and removed from society in perpetuity. And only Russia can do that. There will be no negotiated settlement. And I think that that's just a realistic assessment of the situation. I'm also concerned that any effort to compel Russia to a negotiated settlement would backfire and only engender a harsher response by Russia. And any effort by the West to compel Russia through force of arms would lead to an escalation that could very well result in a general nuclear war. So I think negotiation actually is the worst possible course of action at this point in time. The best thing to hope for is to get the West to stop arming Ukraine, to get the West to walk away from any notion of the potential of Ukrainian victory, to get the West to accept the need and the necessity of mitigating the harm that has already been done to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation by yielding to the inevitability of a Russian victory and hoping that Russia will stop short of the total destruction of the Ukrainian state. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. And I wish you a very successful conference.
This is Ray McGovern who's speaking now, the co-founder of the VIPS.
I would like to start with a slide that shows the words of someone I respect very much. I used to brief him every other morning when he was Secretary of State, George P. Shultz, not to be confused with Scholz. May we have the first slide, please?
Let me just read you what Secretary Schultz said when he reached the ripe old age of 100. He said, I want to offer some thoughts about what we believe about the most important thing in human and international affairs, and that is the matter of trust. Trust is just as important in international affairs as it is in human affairs. We all know that good relations thrive when neighbors trust one another, and that life can become miserable if trust is replaced with suspicion and doubt. There can even be a choice between war and peace based on trust, and that will dominate the nations and relations between nations. He said that just before he died in November 2020. But suffice it to say that in 2 months, I mentioned that Lavrov told Ambassador Burns, look, niet means niet. you allow Ukraine into NATO, that is a red line for us. We will probably have to invade. There will be civil war there. Don't do it. Niet means niet. How do we know that? We have the embassy cable from Embassy Moscow. If I've seen one of those cables, seen about 405,000 of them, and they're genuine. And what he's saying here is what Ambassador Burns recorded. That was February 1, 2008. 2 months later, April 3rd, 2008, NATO, in its wisdom, so to speak, declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Moving on, March 2012, Obama is talking with Medvedev, who is then president of Russia, and he's caught on the microphone at a summit in Seoul, South Korea. And he says, Medvedev says, look, Vladimir wants you to address this missile system in Eastern Europe. He's really interested. Can we talk about that? And Obama said, well, let's wait till I win my election and then win re-election, and then we could talk about it. And then apparently Obama got his promise to do that, and no negotiations really took place. All right, now there was what I call a cameo appearance of trust. And that was in September 2013, after Obama personally, with Vladimir Putin personally, stopped having a war, prevented a war in Syria. Easy. They just agreed to destroy all the Syrian chemical weapons on a ship outfitted for such destruction, the US ship under UN supervision. There was no war. The neocons who wanted that war were very upset about that. Why do I mention that? Well, because that was the last flash of trust. Vladimir Putin had an op-ed in the New York Times on September 12th, 2013, where he said, I really welcome avoiding war in Syria. I really treasure the growing trust, not only between our nations, but between myself and President Obama personally. There's only one thing that I disagree with President Obama on, and he said just last week in a speech that the US is exceptional. I don't agree with that. I don't think any one country is exceptional, writes Putin. I think there are big countries, small countries, countries that are closer to democracy, other countries not so close to democracy. But when God looks down on the world, he considers all nations equal. Well, there was the key. US exceptionalism was going to prevail, and it only took 6 months or so before the neocons, who were really running Obama's policy as they are Biden's, staged a coup on the Maidan in Kiev, overthrew the duly constituted, duly elected government of Kiev, and put in a group very, very heavily influenced by pro-Nazis. That's what started it all. And you don't hear anything about that in the Western press. It's very curious. So that was the last part of trust. After the Maidan, after the revolution, after the two-day pop on February 22nd, 2014, trust evaporated. Now, if you have any doubts about the US orchestrating this coup, the reason that it's called the most blatant coup in history is because the plotters were intercepted in a telephone conversation 2.5 weeks before the coup, and that was put on YouTube. One of the plotters, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the time, Victoria Nuland, was saying, well, we'll put yachts in your, we've got that all, we've got to nail this down. Vice President Biden will come in to solidify this, and then the ambassador in Kiev, our ambassador, asks, well, what about the EU? They're not going to like this. And famously, she uses the F word, which I'm not going to use here. She says, F the EU. I think Germany's part of the EU, so is France. There were no complaints about that I know of. I mean, if somebody said that to me, I would remonstrate. Okay, well, what happened next? Kiev was occupied by these people. Crimea was annexed, as one would expect, given the provocation. And the whole thing is, was this provoked? Well, the annexation of Crimea. I mean, if you don't think that this was provoked, it doesn't matter what John McCain or others said at the time. It was sure as heck provoked by the coup in Kiev. I wrote it up. I wrote a letter to the editor in Washington Post. I said, look, McCain is really wrong here. There is not one scintilla of evidence that it came into Putin's head to annex Crimea before the coup on the 22nd of February, 2014 in Ukraine. Well, next we have Minsk, which has really been given a good explanation what happened in Minsk. And we see the treachery, we see the bragging about, wow, isn't that clever? We held the Russians off. Ukraine was in no shape to face down the Russians. But we sent John Brennan, head of the CIA, to Kiev in April 2014, and he gave him the go-ahead. Go ahead and bloody those people in Lugansk and Donetsk. Give them a good bloody thing, and then we'll have a false kind of outcome, an agreement in Minsk. And we've talked about what happened at Minsk and how Angela Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko himself say, we said there was a little trick. Was this a trick? And we know how Putin feels about that. So what I like to do now is simply focus in on what I know about the reaction in Europe, and specifically in Germany. I lived in Germany for 5 years. I served there. I know a little bit about German history, or maybe more than a little bit. And I like to reflect on where we stand now with respect to the German people and their government. I have a very, very instructive book here. It's called okay, by Sebastian Haffner, the pen name for Raimund Pretzel. Now, he was a judge in training in Berlin in 1933. He was an eyewitness to so much of what happened there. And he wrote this diary, which was only discovered by his children after he died. He was quite a famous journalist or writer in Germany after the war, Sebastian Haffner. Now, what he wrote is very revealing to me, and it really raises the question. Here it is. He's talking about what happened in 1933 and how all of a sudden things fell apart. I'll read it in German and I'll translate it. Wie kann man erklären, das scheinbar Unerklärliche? Die völlige Abwesenheit von einem festen, durch Druck und Zug von außen nicht zu erschütternden Kern. Eine Härte. Eine alle Instanzen gerade erst in der Stunde der Prüfung mobilisieren
mobilisierbaren Reserve an Stolz, Selbstgewissheit, Würde. Das haben die Deutschen nicht. Der März 1933 hat es bewiesen. Im Augenblick der Herausforderung erfolgte in Deutschland ein Nachgeben und Kapitulieren, kurz und gut ein Nervenzusammenbruch. Ende Zitat. Das war 1933. I'll continue in English. That was 1933. Now, that was 90 years ago. More than 70 years after World War II ended. I don't know if Raimund Pretzel's diagnosis of what most Germans felt in 1933 is correct or not. I haven't seen a better explanation for erklären die unerklärbar. So what I'm wondering about here is, would it not be possible to go in 90 years to realize who is deceiving whom, to face up and ask questions? I have two questions that your Außenminister, your foreign minister might ask. One would be to address to Washington. Do you know who blew up Nord Stream 2? I mean, John Brennan says it was probably the Russians. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but maybe it was the Russians, but you know. But we know. I'm certain that we know. Is Bayerbock afraid to ask? Well, I have three things that I'd like to point out. They go back to 2016, the last time I saw important people in Germany. If you have, what do they call it? Beziehungen, yeah. Then you get to see important people. The first was facilitated by my good friend, Norman Birnbaum, who was a really close friend of a fellow named Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Steinmeier told one of his chief lieutenants to receive me and to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. And so a colleague and I went into this very august office, a very senior official, maybe not the deputy, but close to it. You could tell by the size of the office. And we started talking. I'm used to talking in candid terms, as you may know. And we talked about the putsch, the coup d'etat in Kiev. And his name was, what was his name? Philippe Ackermann, okay? He looked at me and he said, what coup? And I said, well, the coup on the 22nd of February, 2014. Steinmeier, your boss was there. What coup? What coup? I got up and walked out. That was one example. Later, I was interviewing, or I was received by the chairman of the Verteidigungsausschuss des Bundestag, the Armed Services Committee of the Bundestag. His name was Wolfgang Helmich. Really nice fellow. Again, Beziehungen. You worked the Beziehungen. So it happened to be the same day that Operation Anaconda, the biggest operation since World War II, Allied forces, NATO forces, right close to the Russian border. They had started. And so I said to Helmut, sir, what do you think of Anaconda? And he looked this way and says, Germany is not involved. I said, but Herr Helmich, your soldiers are participating in it. Well, yeah, but it's not. Well, it was very clear from his body language, if from nothing else, that he was dead set against this, that he felt it foolish. And indeed, it was foolish in the extreme. The same kind of array of forces before Hitler invaded Eastern Europe. So my question was, well, Herr Helmich, can you not do something about this? And the answer was what I fully expected, in effect, no. On the same trip, I was asked to address a Fraktionsmeeting of Die Linke, okay? I was given 10 minutes because the matter of the shooting down of MH17 on the 17th of July, 2014 was very much in the air. And so I explained to them that, you know, there's real doubt with respect to who shot that plane down. And that I'm convinced that if the evidence the US is advertising is valid, well, let me put it this way, they would show it. Here's Secretary Kerry at the time in one of the interviews he gave. We saw the takeoff of the missile. We saw the trajectory. We saw the hit. We saw the airplane disappear from the radar screen. So there is really no mystery about where it came from. Well, okay, let's see the evidence. A long story short, I told the Fraktionsmeeting that there is evidence. I'm 90% sure. I know enough about US intelligence collection capabilities in that area to know that the United States knows who shot that plane down. Then why are they reluctant to release the evidence? And I fully expected, oh, wow, let's ask. But what I got said was, let's go to the next agenda item. I mean, this was not inconsequential. It wasn't the seizing of Crimea. It was the shooting down of MH17 that led to the sanctions that were put in big time in earnest by Europe and by the United States against Russia, Russia being blamed, or pro-Russians being blamed for the shoot down. So again, not an inconsequential thing. So what I'm saying here is that those three experiences with Herr Ackermann, with the Fraktion, the Linke, and with Herr Helmich, made me wonder whether things have changed very much in the last 90 years. I don't know. I hope so. But if they haven't, then we're in more trouble than anyone really expects, because Germany is the fulcrum. There's a very different world now with the lily white West against the rest of the world, mostly of people of color, China, India, the whole rest of the world, okay? And so Germany can act as a fulcrum there, can act as a sensible country interested in friendly, at least non-hostile relations. And the way it has to do that first is recognize what's going on in Ukraine and what the reasons for the lack of trust Putin has. Last thing I'll say on that is joining NATO. Well, yeah, that's a big deal for Ukraine, but it is already, or was becoming already, a de facto member of NATO by having the next to the strongest army in Europe, trained and equipped by the West, and also having just everything it needed to pursue this misbegotten effort to seize not only the Eastern Territories but Crimea. So what would I say at the end? I would say, now, has anyone had a chance to take a look at those view graphs? Because I'd very much like to show the last one. And while we're searching for that, let me just say this, that there comes a time, and this is such a time. There it is. Okay, can you put that up on the full screen? Okay, I wanted you to see that because this is what happened to me when I spoke out in our Bundestag, in our Congress, and said that if you nominate or if you approve the nomination of Gina Haspel, the torturer in chief at the first CIA black site, then this will be a blot on the CIA and on the nation. I spoke out very loudly and I said, you know, she ran that torture chamber with waterboarding and other heinous crimes. Will you approve her nomination? Well, you could see what happened to me. I was taken to ground, as they say. And of course, they approved it. Now, torture. I mean, tomorrow is the anniversary when the first prisoners were brought to Guantanamo with no redress, with no way to challenge their captivity. So let me just finish by this. Daniel Berrigan, who is one of my patrons and one of my teachers, wrote this. And it has to do with what we do besides getting educated, besides listening to what's going on. Here's what Dan wrote. Let us have peace, we cry, but at the same time, let everything remain normal. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison nor ill repute nor disruption of ties with family and friends. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bringing disgrace and prison and death in its wake. And so, such the words of Daniel Berrigan. Last thing I'll say is that when he spoke over Holy Week in South Africa and told people there that they had to do racial justice, this is 40 years ago now, the faithful came up to him after his homily, after his sermon, and they said, but Father Berrigan, if we speak out, we may end up being detained. And what will happen to our children? What will become of our children? And Dan answered very, very quickly. He said, well, if you are not speaking out, and if you're not detained, what then becomes of your children? I think we need to do what was not done in 1933. We need not to be paralyzed by the powers that be. We need to speak out, and I have a certain faith, a certain trust, not only the American people, but the German people, that once they know the truth, well, the truth will set them free and avoid a war. And I applaud Helga and others for putting this seminar together. I just hope that all who are listening can think about what they can do rather than simply sit back and say, oh, isn't that interesting, like the Linke Fraktion did back in 2016. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray, for your assessments and your personal activities in the federal parliament and other way. We're receiving questions through the chat, but you can also send in questions by email to fragen@schiller-institut.de. And you can also send in questions by the chat. Before we go to this, pick up these questions, we have two more speakers. One is General Delawarde, retired general of the French Army, and he was a liaison to the US military school at Fort Leavenworth, and so I give you the word.
Good day to everybody. I'm General Delawarde, the former chief of the intelligence and electronic warfare at the Operational Planning Center of the Army of my country. I wish to all of you a very good new year, hoping it will be better than the preceding one and that things will somehow be clarified. We're here to try to find answers and explore answers to questions asked. First question was, what meaning could have any kind of agreement with representatives of the West if we have to assume that they only do what they say in order to impose their own roadmap? My answer is the following. Any kind of agreement with representatives of the West would have no sense in the current circumstances. Why? Because the given word of the West is worth nothing since the fall of the Soviet Union, because the West has never kept its word since 1990, and because this unfortunate tendency to duplicity and lies has increased over time. Let's remember this terrible confession of Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State at the A&M University of Texas on April 15, 2019, where he said, quote, "We lied, we cheated, we stole, we had entire training courses to learn how to do this. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment." End of quote. And all of this under the thunderous applause of an audience of hilarious young students. With interlocutors of the same model in the diplomacy and more widely in the US and more in general Western administrations, it is hence impossible to negotiate in full confidence. It is not useless to recall some historical facts that Putin has all experienced firsthand. The fake allegations of the Kuwaiti incubators in October 1990, a pretext to start the first Iraq war. The false massacre of Rachak of January 1999, pretext to trigger the final phase of the dismemberment of ex-Yugoslavia and the bombing of Belgrade. The fake testimony at the UN on February 5, 2003 of Colin Powell on the alleged weapons of mass destruction of Saddam Hussein, a fake pretext to launch the Second Gulf War. The numerous false flag gas attacks in Syria between September 2013 and 2018 aim to justify the joint strikes of the Gang of the Three, United States, UK, and France on Syria. The enlargement of NATO towards the east from 1999 to nowadays in total contradiction with all the promises made to Gorbachev in 1990. One might add to this the setting up of the Skripal affair by the United Kingdom and the Navalny affair by the European Union, with the constant aim of smearing Russia and more particularly Putin himself. This duplicity of Anglo-Saxon origin has been observed and experienced, lived through by the entire planet. It has provoked a real worldwide consciousness and awareness, aroused a lot of reprobation, rejection, and even exasperation. Since his arrival to power, Putin has lived through 22 years of duplicity and lies of the West. Today, the cup is full, and the trust has been totally destroyed by the confessions of Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, saying to the face of the entire world that the Minsk agreements were not made to be respected, but to gain time to prepare Ukraine for war against Russia. At the point where we stand, the lies of the West, can confidence be restored? My answer is no. Why? Because the reestablishment of trust can only be achieved by the pure and simple disappearance from the world political landscape of the US and European neoconservative and globalist establishment. As long as this disappearance is not achieved and made a reality, the restoration of trust will remain impossible, because the project for a new century of American hegemony, obtained by all means, will remain the rule for the US and the EU administrations. This ousting of the globalist neoconservatives linked to the financial powers that make the sun shine and the rain fall in the US, be it in the presidential or legislative elections, is so far unthinkable, seeing the considerable financial means devoted to the conquest and the management of power. Putin's Russia, therefore, has to do everything possible to break this dream by weakening the Western eagle and by cutting its wings. Yesterday, Russia lost the Cold War by an economic and social collapse. Today, it will seek an economic and social collapse of the global West by deploying, with its numerous and powerful allies and partners, the energy weapon, and by breaking into pieces the monopoly of the dollar. On the Ukrainian theater, Russia will only negotiate when the time is ripe, from a position of strength and on its own terms. But it must give time to time, because time for the moment is playing in its favor by precipitating the West into economic and social difficulties. So there's nothing to be expected on the short term, nothing to be expected before, at best, the summer of 2023, and more likely 2024. An additional winter, at least, to achieve the weakening of the Western economies and the territorial conquest in Ukraine would not be a surprise for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, General Delawarde. Now we follow up with the speech with Colonel Corvez, who is an advisor in security questions and is known in France for his gaullistic ideas of sovereignty and the right to self-determination.
So the confidence disappeared from Russia, and we are in a dramatic situation because, as it has been said, has been explained, Putin proposed in 2020-2021 agreements with the United States and NATO to impede this war, to assure the security, the legitimate security of Russia. And we entered in a special operation, military operation, who is becoming more and more a war of NATO against Russia. So my feeling is that the United States wanted to, by this mean, to assure his power and to assure the continuity of his hegemony in the world. And the United States wanted to weaken Russia and maybe destroy it, divided it in different parts. But I think that now the United States realized their mistake in their analysis, in their project, and more experts in the United States tell that the war cannot be won by NATO, and they have to find an end to this war. So why can't they win this war? Because they understand now that Russia has just adapted a new strategy on the field, and this strategy is a winning strategy because every day all the Ukrainian operations are failing and are bringing a lot of deaf people. So I found it very dramatic that United States and NATO are using the Ukrainian lives to maintain their hegemony in the world, because that's impossible today. And I believe by United States, with some of the experts in the United States, some people in the intelligence, some of them who are in charge of defining some politics in the United States, they realized that their objective won't be attainable. So now, because they see that Russia is more and more strong with China now, and has a lot of partnership with the BRICS, and also partnership with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So more and more the conflict is continuing, more the anti-American feeling is strong. So now people in the United States are concluding that we have to finish this war. We have to find a solution, honorable solution. So Helga Zepp-LaRouche talked about the Vatican initiative, and I think that Rome indeed could be a place, useful place, to try to find a way to negotiate peace negotiations. But as Delawarde said, peace negotiations will be realized with the conditions, with Russian conditions, because Russia will give its conditions, and if the conditions, Russian conditions, are respected, we can negotiate. But how can you negotiate agreements with people who are lying permanently, and it's even a lying doctrine by themselves? So I think that the more accurate minds in the United States are starting to make the Biden administration understand that it's in the United States interest to stop that. So I will quote a very short quote of Biden when Zelensky was visiting Washington in December. But I will quote it at the end because I think that it's showing something interesting. I mean, a lot of journalists missed it, but I think we have to read between the words in this quote. So I will quote it afterwards. So, but I think that we have to get out of the conflict. And I just repeat, Ukrainian people are the victims, very sad victims of this horrible war. and it will be more and more horrible because of the cold, the winter's coming. I mean, the winter we are in. And they don't deserve that, really. And I think in history, United States will be judged as the provocateur of the war, but also they behaved with Ukraine in a way, terrible, awful way, to use people, the life of people to attain an objective that won't be really, they won't realize it's terrible. So I think that the United States really are convinced, some of the people in the United States are convinced that we have to stop that. And they are, you know, they are touched by the backfires of sanctions also. So you have a lot of, you know, in Europe and United States, so you have a lot of people and a lot of governments who are understanding that it's not in their interest to continue this war, and it's only the pursuit of an objective in which Europe doesn't have any interest. So in Ukraine also, you have also a flashback, a backfire of the sanctions. So by the fact that China, for instance, which is the first economic power, is becoming the first economic power in the world, has a monopoly in some of the technologies. Now China is touching American economy, the American economy, by, you know, the sanctions, because of the sanctions that the United States are imposing to Russia and other countries. So United States economy is threatened, and by that we will assist in next month. We will see a change, a twist in the American politics. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that. And as we are in a dramatic situation, tragic situation, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche told that we are very close to a world war, a third world war, and it would be nuclear war. So I think that we must, in the United States, they have to stop with Zelensky and find a solution. So I will quote Biden. So it's in English. Please make sure that you can translate it in French.
Ukraine with advanced gear could break apart NATO. President Biden hinted at a rift in the alliance of Western nations arming Ukraine on Wednesday in last December, making the alarming claim that giving Kiev access to NATO's most advanced gear could tear the alliance in two. The idea, et le journaliste cite Biden.
And the journalist is quoting Biden.
The idea that would give Ukraine material that is fundamentally different from its is already going there would have the prospect of breaking up NATO and breaking up the European Union. Si on continue à fournir de l'armement,
so if we are continuing to bring weapons to Ukraine,
Biden said after Ukrainian reporter asked him why the US was not giving the most advanced weaponry to the war-torn nation. The United States are not looking to go to war with Russia. They are not looking for a third world war. Et le journaliste ukrainien insistant,
the Ukrainian journalist in the questions
He said,
and answers
there is
said,
more to say, but I have probably already said too much. He added. Voilà. Then, je veux dire par là que
what I
si
want
on
to
lit entre
say
les mots
is
cette
that if
déclaration
we are reading
du
between the
président
words
Biden fin
in
décembre,
this
au moment de la
Biden
visite de
speech,
Zelensky,
when Zelensky went to Washington,
des
it's
experts et
clear
des
that
services
some experts
américains
in
ont
the
dit à
intelligence
l'administration
services of the United
américaine, il
States
faut sortir de
told the
cette guerre, il
administration we have to
dessert
get out of this war
désormais.
that is
Nous,
deserved that is
notre économie est
against
touchée, mais non seulement cela,
our interests in our economical
l'OTAN va être
interests,
disloquée et
and
même
because
l'Union
it would be a
européenne.
danger for
Alors, que l'Union
NATO,
européenne soit disloquée,
and
je
also
n'y verrai que
for
du bien
United
parce que cette
for
organisation
European Union.
technocratique détruit
Well, I
l'Europe.
would say that if
le
European
fait
Union is destroyed by that, it would be good. I
pourrait
mean,
venir des
the European
États-Unis
Union,
pour des
not
négociations
Europe,
de paix
but if
à
it
Rome ou
brings
ailleurs, parce que
some peace
ils ont compris
negotiations,
que
it would be good
ils étaient
because
maintenant
the
les
United
perdants
States would
et il valait mieux
understand that
arrêter les pertes
they will
avant
be the
qu'elles ne soient trop
losers of
grandes. Je
this
suis prêt à
conflict.
répondre ensuite aux questions
So
parce
I'm
que
ready to answer the
comprends que
questions
c'est un
because I
peu
understand that
énigmatique ce qu'a
it's a little
dit
bit enigmatic
Biden,
what
mais
Biden
en tout cas
said,
moi c'est ainsi
but
que je
that's
l'interprète.
how I interpret it.
Je vous remercie. Je
So
suis
thank
prêt à
you very
répondre aux
much,
questions ensuite.
and I will answer the questions afterward.
Ganz herzlichen Dank.
We have seen of the 5 participants of the discussion, we have 4 still here: General Delawarde, Colonel Corvez, Ray McGovern, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And I would like those people to give a statement on what they have heard and what they think about it. And perhaps I start with Helga, and then
Okay. Ja, also ich bin nicht
I
überrascht
am
über
not
die.
surprised about the positions that have been presented by Scott Ritter and General Delawarde, because I have heard them quite a number of times, also from Russian representatives and militaries. Of course, if you look at the situation as it presents it now, it is a very likely development. But I wanted to stress in my remarks that the risk is enormous, and this is the most dangerous situation, in my opinion, in world history. Because in the First and the Second World War, we were not faced with the possibility that humanity might be wiped out. And well, I can send you a link to the presentation of the nuclear expert Stephen Starr, who makes clear what is going to happen in a nuclear war. If it happens, it will come to an exchange of nuclear warheads, and it will not be limited. I think the idea that you can have a limited, winnable nuclear war, which is at this time the premises of the Western military planning, I think this is totally irreal. It's if there is a nuclear war, all the arsenals will be employed, and I can only advise you to watch this video or read it, read the presentation. If that happens, then there is going to be a nuclear winter for 10 years worldwide, globally. No plants will grow, no food will grow, and people will starve. So we have to start all deliberation from this danger of annihilation of humanity. And that must override all the particular interests of parties, of nations. this is not, we're not used to look at things this way, but we have to put the common interest of humanity first. If the survival of humanity is threatened, there is only one solution, that you have to stop doing what is threatening humanity. And there are a lot of nations people who say that the Vatican is not suitable to do that. But I think that the institution of the Catholic Church and the person of Pope Francis, you can have different opinions, but we need a figure that symbolizes the unity of humanity and presents a position which is above the particular interests and the party interests. We need a point where we can assemble all of humanity around. And I think that the Augustinian tradition within the Catholic Church, the teachings of Nicolaus of Tours, who proposed the idea that there can be a coincidence of opposites. The idea that there is a higher level where there is a one, where all the oppositions cease to exist. And this principle can be applied to all areas of human life. And I think that is what created the basis for the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, where all parties agreed that from now on, that after the war, nobody could profit. And if nobody survives, there is no profit for anyone. And this is not, we don't need to win the Pope for this, because he has already offered to accept that role. But the people in Europe, the people in America, the people in the global South, they must recognize the danger that humanity is in. And that will create the strength to change the policies. Sure, the Russians will try to go this way that was described, but there is the risk that this goes terribly wrong. And with all respect to my colleagues from France or Scott Ritter already, who have the security background, with all respect for this knowledge and expertise, I think we have to assume a different outlook for this crisis. And I think that this coincidence of opposites, the coming together of the opposites, is the only way out of the crisis. This is also the position of Albert Einstein, who says that a solution is never on the level of the problem that created the problem, but that the human mind must define a higher level which makes a solution possible. And we have proposed security and development architecture and principles for that. And I invite all the people who are watching this discussion to look deeper into this, because people have to ask themselves, how can humanity give itself a world order where it can survive? Thank you. I would like to invite Dominique Delawarde to comment on what was said up to now.
No, I really think that we can dream about about an agreement, but I think I insist that this agreement will be made on the terms of the Russians. Russia has proposed many times to the West to negotiate, particularly in the last months of 2021. They made proposals and they invite their partners, Western partners, to discuss with them to build the architecture of security for the world and for them, of course. And the West, and particularly the US and NATO, just didn't answer to these proposals. They just ignore the proposals of Russia. And Russia has a background of 22 years of lies. And more than that, 32 years of lies since 1990. So now you cannot negotiate without a minimum of confidence. So I think negotiation will be made when Russia will be in situation to do it and to impose its will. It's I'm sorry, but we cannot always think that the opposing side of the West, the Russian side, has to make concession. Now, Russia has tried all the solution, and this solution were without any fruits. Now, it's time to, the history has to continue like before. That is to say that the force, the military, on the result of this war will be made not only on the battlefield, but mainly, I think, on the economic side. Russia has well understood that the Western world is in troubles now. And he will try to make this war a little bit longer, just to let the West in its troubles, and maybe collapsing after this trouble. So I think economy will be the, we will call the West to more thinking and more reason. And the West will have to adopt a reasonable way to discuss with Russia. And with a lack of confidence, of course, Russia will have to be very, very vigilant on the Western proposals, because the agreement with the Westerners are always made to be forgotten with the time. You know, we will never apply our own agreement if we sign an agreement with Russia. I understand Russia, you know. Today, what they can think about our words. We have no words in the West now. We are not reliable enough to be a good partner. So I think economy, the result of the next year of economy, will force the Western leaders to think again about the Ukrainian crisis and about the security of Russia, and the plan to dismember Russia made by Westerners made by the US neoconservative people, I think this plan has failed and will fail. So wait and see.
Ray, what is your position?
Well, I like to keep things simple here and would ask people to see a map of Ukraine and surrounding countries in their mind's eye, and then see a map of the Caribbean 60 years ago when Khrushchev tried to put offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, the US had the predominant strength in the Caribbean. To the US, that was an existential threat, with missiles hitting Washington, D.C. and Omaha, Nebraska in minutes, okay? To Khrushchev, nothing ventured, nothing gained. He thought he might get away with it, but it was not an existential threat to Khrushchev. And so he backed down and he withdrew the missiles. Look at that map of Ukraine again. Who has the predominant power? You don't have to be a military analyst in the army, as I was for 2 years, to realize that Russia has what even Obama called escalatory dominance, okay? It can escalate, and my friends, it can win short of the use of nuclear weapons. So what I'm saying here is that someone talked about Gegensätze. Well, you know, there's a kind of a conceptual disconnect here in the US policymakers' mind. They want to avoid a nuclear war, Biden has said so many times, and World War III, okay? But they also think they're winning in Ukraine and that Russia can be defeated. These 2 points of view cannot be reconciled. Why? Because for Putin, it's an existential threat to have missiles on the border of Russia in the east, which are being prepared, and some of those holes are already in Romania and in Poland. It's an existential threat for Putin. Is it an existential for the threat to the United States? Not so much, okay? So what has to happen here is that these sophomores who are advising Mr. Biden have to get it into their head that Russia is not losing. Russia is not going to lose, as Scott Ritter said, unless the US does something really stupid and escalates up to the point of the use of nuclear weapons. Russia is not going to need to use nuclear weapons. The United States and these crazy, we call them the crazies, these neocons, they might be tempted to do that. So what happens? Well, if we talk about the European Union or the European countries, the ones that Victoria Nuland, who's running our policy, make no mistake, the ones she said they should, well, she said F the EU, didn't she? Well, that's how they look at the EU and look at Germany. So here's what Herr Scholz, not Herr Schulz, needs to do. He's complaining yesterday about, Panzer too, these fancy armaments, these fancy tanks. They want me to go to Ukraine, but I want to wait to see what France does or what Britain does. Or, you know, I don't want to be the first one. Well, what Scholz should say is 9, 9, 9. We're not going to do that. We're not going to make sure, we're not going to ensure that the Russians decapitate Ukraine. No, and they have the ability to do that. Last thing here is, are the Russians willing to negotiate? Well, of course they are, but they're willing to negotiate only after people take into account the gains that they have made. And they're willing to, I think, they're willing to divide Ukraine right down through the Dnieper River, a natural boundary, okay? Now, where's Odessa? Oh, Odessa's on the west. It's on the western part of Ukraine, on the west of the Dnieper. So what happens to it? Broad hint in Putin's remarks at the end of his long interview with Valdai on the 27th of October. He says, you know, Odessa could be, what does he call it? A яблоко раздора. It could be an apple of discord. You all know your mythology, right? Apple of discord launched the 20-year Trojan War. It could be a яблоко раздора, or it could be a way to get through this and get to really meaningful negotiations and avoid this kind of problem. Well, what happened to that? Never mentioned in the press. But these things do not happen by chance. It was a canned question he was asked, I'm convinced. And here he is saying, look, Odessa, we could take Odessa, but let's make a deal. We will not go into Odessa and occupy it. If you make it an international city, we'll stay on the other side of the Dnieper River, and we'll work things out. And you can still have some access to the sea. We're not really interested in conquering all of Ukraine. We'll stop, but you have to agree to recognize what has already happened on the ground. And there has to be some sort of agreement for a ceasefire zone or a demilitarized zone where Ukrainians will not be shooting at our people in Donbass anymore. The makings of an accord, of an abkommen, of some kind of negotiated settlement are there. But the Russians are not going to be deceived again, as many have said. And the Americans don't seem to realize that they do not have the upper hand, that rather than winning, they are losing. And with the ground freezing in the next 2 weeks, I fear what's going to happen when those 300,000 Russian troops start moving to the west.
Thank you very much, Alain Corvez. Can you hear me?
No, I agree with. Yes. Yeah, I agree with what has been said. What I can and as the theme of the conference was the confidence in international relations, it's very important to understand that the Europeans and the allies of the United States, they lost all confidence, all credibility for the other countries who are trying to create a multipolar world, creating confidence between each others. So kind of confidence which is not like the European Union now. I mean, you know, above the states, destroying the states, bureaucratic organization. We're talking about a real nation states cooperation and confidence. And because all the organizations who have been created, like the United Nations and others, those who are created by the countries of the BRICS and others, are institutions created with the real confidence, and the problem is that European Union, for instance, has not been built on that. and those countries are organizing themselves to face the American hegemony. Those countries, a part of Western countries, are very powerful. And the fact that the United States economy is now finished is because the war in Ukraine showed that the United States hegemony in the world is finished, and it could go further because the financial situation of the United States could be very bad, and the dollar could lose its value because the dollar is a monkey money. It doesn't worth anything in reality. So, and it can't, you know, the money that is supporting Ukraine is only paper. There's no economy behind. I mean, so it's pure money creations, hyperinflationary money. So the fact that the United States destroyed, the fact that the Western countries destroyed the confidence, and the fact that it had been destroyed by the policy they have implemented. Now, the United States will have to adapt to this situation they created. And that's what Trump said when he was president, but he couldn't do that. He talked about this kind of new world that United States, to which the United States should adapt. And the fact that, for instance, United States and the Western countries will have to accept the conditions of other countries and the dynamic of the new world created by the BRICS and others. So we have to bet this the possibility of having a world more peaceful.
So we've got questions coming in from the chat and from emails. And we can now have time to answer those.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your contributions. We've received a number of questions and comments.
Questions you can send in
the
at
chat, and you can send more at Fragen at
I will
Schiller
read the questions in German.
.de.
I hope this will work.
And we will get back to these questions.
So
Then I have one
simple or maybe not so simple question.
Fairly simple question.
As this was the title,
the title of
our talk. Why is there not a parliamentary committee to check Merkel's words on the Minsk Accords? Yeah, we could not hear Helga now. I said that is because of what they call Fraktionszwang, this parliamentary system of the parties. I met over the years many parliamentarians who told me that what I said was very interesting, but if they would ever talk about that in their own party faction, they would certainly lose their seat. Their own party would make them lose their seat. So they could not talk about it. I agree with a lot of what was said by my co-reference. It may come that way, but it's important not to look at history at diamat or histomat, something objective. But the sickness is in the culture in the West, because our citizens are not real citizens. I think it was Scott Ritter who said that people are so small now in their thinking, only about pleasure, and they don't take any responsibility for their country and even less the world. And a part of the idea of our campaign is that we want this quality of citizens, we want that back. And the idea of Staatskunst, the art, statecraft. That's a reason why the Schiller Institute was founded decades ago as an institute for statecraft. This did not change in all those years, but today the BRICS plus SCO, and many in the global south are trying to make a new paradigm in world politics, and they are formulating a lot of good ideas. And my 10 principles try to give coherence to that. And we need real citizens, or make people wake up and take responsibility. And the Parliament, Bundestag, will only react when we have many citizens who are awake, which is something that is working better in the US, where they have you have to be put under pressure. You have to call and say you will be voted out if you don't change. And we want to be a real republic. We are called Bundesrepublik, but this works only if you have real citizens who are working for the common good. Therefore, I hope that you all work with us for this change in Germany. Thank you, Ray. Would you like to answer that question?
I think Helga has said it elegantly. I have nothing to add right now.
So I'll have a question, which may be directly for you, Ray. Jason Ross from the US, a member of our activist of our Schiller Institute, he's asking, what can the American people do, and the people of other NATO states, to end the war? What is your advice for building a movement to end the weapons deliveries?
I think that the most fertile avenue, the best approach would simply be to spell out the costs of 112 billion, that's billion with a B, arms aid to Ukraine in what I believe to be a silly and unproductive endeavor. The economists talk about costs, what do they call it? Opportunity costs. Okay, now this is a sort of fancy word for what could we do in the United States if we invested $112 billion to get people out of poverty. There are far too many people in the United States in poverty. There are far too many people in the United States who don't have good schools, and some of our bridges are falling down. There is so much that this money could do in the United States, and that is demonstrable. Okay, so my notion is that anyone who is really interested in bringing people out of poverty or repairing our infrastructure needs to do some math and do some comparison. And if they just take what one B-21 or one F-35 costs and put that into their state into their into Nebraska or Omaha or Kansas, and see what they could do with that money to make life better for these people, then they might get conscientized. They might get aware that this is really silly. And last but not least, who's getting this money really? Is it the Iranian? Is it the Ukrainian army? Give me a break. It's disappearing. It's going to the oligarchs in Ukraine, and it's going to Raytheon and Lockheed and Grumman and all those Northrop people, all those people here that make the arms and sell the arms. And that's why when Pope Francis came here to the United States and spoke before Congress, he spoke about the main problem being what he called the blood-drenched arms trade, period, end quote. That's what we have to make sure people know about. It's hard because the media is part of the complex here, but we can do it. I believe we can do it. Actually, there is no choice. We have to do it.
Thanks a lot. I pose the next question to our French security expert, Stella Johnny writes, Professor Michael Hudson wrote that the US economy is in danger of collapse. And there is a de-dollarization going on, the plans of the BRICS for an alternative financial system. Is it possible that this is the real reason for that proxy war? The fear of the state bankruptcy in the US or other places, and what would be a way to proceed from there? You have to unmute your microphone. Okay.
The question is for me? Yes. I think today, when we observe the collapsing of the Western economies, it's not only the US, it's mainly the EU. And not only the EU, but also all the countries who are linked with the EU. For example, today or yesterday, Switzerland, which is supposed to be neutral, but which is not so neutral than that, because they choose to align themselves on the Western world. So the National Bank of Switzerland announced the biggest loss ever in 116 years, $143 billion. That is not a small loss. It represents 18% of the Swiss GDP. That's not nothing. It's very important. So that will have consequences on all the life of Swiss citizen. The citizen of Switzerland will have much less public money to make their life better. That will be the money will make the winner of this war. We speak about BRICS and Western world, that you have to say that in power parity dollars, the BRICS now are more have more money than the G7. BRICS is this year. The data from IMF of 11 October, last 11 October, says that the BRICS now have more money than the G7 and more money than all the 30 members, all the EU plus US plus EU in parity of money, parity of power parity. So the world has changed. Now the power is not anymore on the Western side, is not anymore on the G7 side, is not anymore in the US and Europe, EU side, is on the BRIC side, and it will be more and more. Year after year, it will more and more be on the side of the BRICS. Why? Because the BRICS have 15 candidates knock at the door of the BRICS to be member of the BRICS. That's a sign that these countries want to be part of an organization where in which the countries respect the others. That's and in BRICS, it's not like in transatlantic relation, you know. Transatlantic relation, you have a big boss with a gun, which is the US, saying to the European Union, do that, and if you don't do that, you will be fired. That's the kind of relation in the Western world. That's not acceptable, and a lot of countries prefer to be part of the BRICS instead of be part of the Western world. The Western world, 12% of the population of the planet. The BRICS and all the fund, the people who support the BRICS, it's the rest of the planet is almost 80%. And certain countries like Japan and Taiwan and South Korea will shift on the side of the Western world. But altogether, this kind of balance, it's finished for us. It's finished for the West, because people don't want anymore the tyranny of the Western world. And they try to organize. And if you add the GDP of all the 15 candidates to the BRICS in power parity, that's a huge amount of money, and the Western world cannot impose anymore with a gun the behavior of such a country. You know, we impose always, we give moral lessons to the world. You know, we are the best. We are democratic country. We are not democratic at all. We are not democratic at all. The medias make the public opinion, and the people behind the medias, the billionaires who control the medias, in fact, are the people who control the world. And today, our Western world is not very attractive for the 180 countries on the planet. 170 countries doesn't want to be part of this Western world with always a gun on their head. You know, that's not possible. We cannot continue. The world cannot continue to work like this. And the people, the billionaires, you know, I was studying the evolution of the money plus all position in the US. In the US, 1%, the richest, 1% of the richest have used to have in 1989, they have 17%, 1% of the people have 17% of all the US goods, all the US money, all the 1% in 1989. Now they have 27%. So from in 30 years, they increase the money. So the rich people become richer and richer and richer, and they have so much money that they have more money than the GDP of more than half of people of the planet, half of the nations of the planet. We cannot continue like that, because these people who have a lot of money already, they want to always more. They want always more. And behind this war of Ukraine war, you have that. You have the problem of the money. These people who have the money in the US and elsewhere in the world, they want, in fact, more money. They want to conquer, to dismember Russia. They have dismembered former Yugoslavia already. They have a very good example. With one big country, they make 5 smaller countries, very small and so very obedient. They are ready to obey, and particularly if they have a gun on the head. So that's the world. And today, the people, the richest people in the US, the billionaires, 750 billionaires in the US, they have more money than a lot of states, you know, and they want to have more, and they want, in fact, to weaken the Russia. And at the end of the day, at the end of the decade, or at the end of the century, they want Russia to be cut in several parts and control everything from the US. So that will fail. It's finished. It's finished. The billionaires have to think, to search another solution, because that will not be possible, because Russia now is not alone. Russia is supported by a lot of allies, with the BRICS, with the organization of Shanghai organization, with a lot of a net of alliance, and they will win. They will win economically, they will win militarily, and they will win. We are also in a war of civilization, you know. We are losing in the West, we are losing all our value. We are going towards wokeism and a lot of other things like that. Russia is not, they let us do whatever we want, but they want to keep their own value, which are not at all our value. They want to keep their own value, and we will see, but I am optimistic for them. And maybe they can teach us what is, in terms of value, they have more to bring to us than we have to bring to them. You know, wokeism is not the right way to see the future of the world. That's it. That's all what I have to say. Too long.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
I am too passionate.
See by their faces that Helga and Ray are having thoughts. So maybe first Helga and then Ray may either answer the question or comment on what the general just said.
I'd be happy to. Let's see, I probably should. Sure. Yeah, I would just say briefly that I have no confidence in the political or foreign policy advisors that are around President Biden. I thought ever since the beginning of his administration that they were inexperienced, they were laden with the idea that they were exceptional, indispensable even. They had no appreciation of how the world was turning out. Especially, they thought that China would be more interested in improving relations with the United States than China would be interested in improving relations with Russia. They picked a fight with both, with Russia and China. And no less a man than Putin himself has said, you know, I thought there might be some subtle reason why they declared China an even more drastic enemy than us, the Russians. But I have to conclude that no, there's no subtle reasoning there. They're just crazy. Putin's word. Well, their inexperience, I would not disagree that they're crazy. Now, the other thing is the economic advisors. My God, I thought that his advisors could not get any worse than the foreign policy ones. And what do I know? The economic ones turned out to be still worse. I don't know where he gets these people. It shows itself in many respects, and many of those have been just elucidated. The thing that I would cite now is a broader picture. I talked about opportunity costs, fancy word for what else you could do with this money rather than give it to the arms traders, the blood-soaked arms traders. Well, you know, I would call it the mother of all opportunity costs, global warming. Don't these rich people have children or grandchildren? Don't these policymakers know what's necessary now to cooperate with China, with Russia, with everybody to make sure that there's a livable planet in 2 generations? Don't they know that? Well, if they know it, there seems to be just prescinding from it, to use a philosophical term, that they're suppressing it. And so that's what I would contribute now. The mother of all opportunity costs. I need to duck out for a second.
Helga, möchtest du jetzt noch etwas kommentieren? Oh, Helga, would you like
No.
to comment something?
What's that? Yeah, good.
To come back to the very first question of our seminar, what about an international law, Mrs. Merkel? So you have to say that this is obviously not very positive, because the people in the West who are on the high horse say we're the rule-based order and we're the good ones. We can tell others what they have to think. If you take a closer look, it's these rules are made by someone. It's not transparent. It's these billionaires who control right now the media. The big corporations
Loud and clear.
control the financial system.
May I go back?
But it's not international law, and many nations have recognized this. They don't want any more colonialism. The reason why the BRICS are so attractive, why 17 nations are now trying to become members, the reason is that the system of the BRICS is based on the UN Charter principles of peaceful coexistence, the ghost of Bandung, spirit of Bandung. And all of this is not about Ukraine or the East-West conflict. It's a conflict between those who want to keep the colonial order where the global south is underdeveloped, and the class of the rich has all privileges, and they don't care. When in their own countries, poverty is increasing. The subject of fighting poverty is not a subject in the EU. In China, this was the absolute priority subject. They put 800 million people out of poverty in their country. Another model of China is a Belt and Road Initiative. It is now offered to other countries, and this offers them for the first time the possibility to get out of underdevelopment. So the West is now demolishing itself. The idea that for example, Frau Baerbock took away a crucifix from the wall when the foreign ministers met, or that they renamed the Bismarck Saal. It is a sign that the West is demolishing itself, and there's destroying the old, but not putting nothing good new in its place. And while China is a 5,000-year-old history, similar for India, Vietnam, they all know that they are cradles of mankind. And now they define from that perspective a positive future. And we do the opposite. We bury our humanist tradition. Just ask young people here what they know about this. They think Leibniz is a cookie. And before I forget, Mr. Hollande, we should call him the lying Dutchman, the lügende Holländer. So I think this pun also works in French. I think this is a good label for him. But we have to revive our own humanist tradition. In China, Xi Jinping, who's called a dictator and whatever here, he works for aesthetical education of Chinese youth with great Chinese and universal culture. And he said, aesthetical education is important so that the students become have a beautiful mind. And a beautiful mind is the beginning for great pieces of art and science. Whereas that here, anything that is perverse is in the media, number one. And the principle of our elites towards the people is that have them as degraded as possible, because then they might be better to control. So our entertainment culture is so-called, is so terrible. There's no more good movies, no good entertainment, while the Chinese might be a bit more radical. They say certain types of pop music, hip hop, and other things are bad. They are putting forward a bad image of women, so we ban that. So we may not be as extremes, but it's important to have in society that young people want to be astronauts, want to develop Africa, and they want a mission in their life. That is a healthy society. And our society is because of this counterculture, which, by the way, my late husband already in the 60s defined as the most evil thing which will destroy the West, which I think is one of his best ideas. But if we don't change this in the West very quickly, Europe will be a relic of history, and you will watch it in a museum in Congo or South America, and people will see it as an example of a culture which went under. And I don't want that to happen. We have in Europe great cultural with Italian Renaissance, École Polytechnique in France, classical music in Germany, and we have to make these things alive in our population, or we will be not much remembered in history. Well, this may happen, but let's not hope so. Another question on the for the grand scale, the grand scene. Mr. Chibanza, what can Africa do to help the West and Russia to make peace? Can the non-aligned movement work at this critical moment? So who wants to answer first? Helga? I think they are already doing it. During the Ukraine conflict, the US put maximum pressure on the so-called third world that they had to take sides of the so-called democracies. Mr. Blinken and Mrs. Baerbock, they ran around the globe and told everyone you have to be on the side of the West, of the democracies, against the autocracies. But these countries didn't cave into the pressure. For example, India, which was really courted as the biggest democracy, which must be in the camp of the West, but they said, no, we remember our non-aligned tradition, we won't take sides. Same for Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, many countries, they refused. Because in the UN, there was because they made it a non-secret vote. And many nations have problems with their debt service and all that things. But that's the reason why the votes in the UN went that way they went. But for example, I was in Bali and there's a totally different mood, a non-aligned spirit, which is coming, you see it in the BRICS. If you look at Latin America, there's this guy Bannon who's trying to, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, is really to make life difficult for Lula. There was this storm on the parliament building. And in many nations in South America, there's similar things, but 80% of the countries in Latin America for the BRICS, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, many Caribbean states. One of the most important changes the last period is that the Middle East changed. The US have lost nearly all their influence in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so forth. They want to be with the new Silk Road. And the same is for many, many African countries, and also the Eurasian Economic Union. They are working on the new currencies. There's a de-dollarization because the US was so stupid, in my opinion, to make the dollar a weapon, weaponize the dollar by confiscating money of other nations, 300 billion from Russia, 9 billion from Afghanistan and others like Venezuela. And so the Global South drew the conclusion that if our money is not secure there and the colonialism lives on, that was already said in the Bandung conference decades ago, But colonialism lives on in modern clothing, in the trade relations. And these countries have understood that, and they don't want it to go on. So they are looking for other cooperation and without political interference in the internal affairs. So we're actually in a good position. And I think the more we make this discussion international, the more Africa plays a role in this, because Africa is the continent of the future. 2050, there'll be 2.5 billion Africans. And until then, we need at least 1 billion productive jobs. So because Ray is talking about this, how we can use the money better. So what we have to make is get in the US and in Europe to give this old policy and see that it's in their own interest and in whole humanity's interest to work with big projects in Africa and Middle East, big works. All these nations that had wars like Libya, Syria, and so forth, after these intervention wars, and build up Africa and collaborate with that. And make that the big subject of humanity today. I think that's the way out. And yes, now Ray, please.
I just would like to say that the residue, I'll call it that, of colonialism is smelling to high heaven. It's amazing that after a century that US policymakers have not been educated on the poetry of Rudyard Kipling, who said, "It is not wise for the Christian white to hustle the Asian brown, for the Christian riles and the Asian smiles, and he weareth the Christian down. At the end of the fight lies a tombstone white with the name of the last deceased, and the epitaph drear. A fool lies here who tried to hustle the East." So I think we're aware of the trends. Some policymakers more belatedly than the rest of us. But in a very serious vein, what worries me is how Mr. Putin looks at these things. The policymakers, foreign policy, economic policy makers around Biden seem uneducable. They seem to persist in their exceptional outlook at things. And as things start to go perceptibly down for them, Mr. Putin's worry has to be, will they pull the pillars down with them as Samson did in the Bible? Will they try to stop this by doing something more stupid than they've already done? And I refer, of course, to nuclear weapons. And that's why I think it's so important for us to hash out all these reasons that drive policymakers, but to realize that there's a degree of adolescence in US policymakers that must worry Putin and his generals sick. And so, what does that mean? That means we're really on tenterhooks, as they say. We're really in a position where Putin has to decide, whoa, when could these unwashed, benighted people, most of whom have no military experience, vis-a-vis the Russians that do have military experience, 26 million killed in World War II, for example. How do we protect against these people? Right now, the issues are joined in Ukraine. And if my view and Scott Ritter's and others is correct, this winter and early spring, we'll see the Russians moving to the west. I think they can be stopped. I don't think Putin really wants to take over all of southern and western Ukraine, certainly not all of western Ukraine. I think he's ready to do a deal, but the deal has to incorporate the gains that Russia has already made and Crimea as well. So if the West is not willing to negotiate in that kind of vein, then I dare say I fear for what will happen, because as the Chinese used to say, it will come to a no good end.
Now, one question maybe to put attention back to Germany. Question by Jan Christian Lebitz. He poses it to Ray, because he said that, because he had these quotes of Hafner since 1933, there has not changed that much. How do you explain that in the last 90 years in Germany, there was not really a fundamental change, especially if you look at re-education of Germans after World War II? Maybe the question can answer Ray, but also Helga.
Well, of course, I have less credentials to answer this question. 5 years in Germany does not qualify. But I just, I'm aware of the Gehorsamkeit, the obedient, the notion that if we just keep our heads down, nothing bad will happen to us. And of course, that was what obtained in 1933. Hafner, or Raymond Potzel, writes it in his diary. I hope that's changed, but I haven't observed much change. And it's been 90, count them, 90 years. It's high time there's change. Actually, there are existential threats to the German economy and to the German ability to keep themselves warm this winter. I would hope that, if nothing else, would get Germans energized. And again, I apologize for commenting on these things, but that's the way I see them. Maybe Helga can add more educated views to the ones I've just expressed.
Ich habe in den 80er Jahren ein
In the
Buch
1980s, I published a book which is called The Hitler Project. And in it, I have to tell you this shortly. I had in school in history, 3 times we went through the Stone Age to the World War I 3 times, but never World War II. So then I had a culture shock. When I came to the US for the first time, you had all these films on television with the evil Germans. So very quickly, I made a crash program in history about newly published documents from the Library of Congress, and studied them. And that's how that Hitler book came about. And I had the thesis that the Germans will only be really free when they know how this project Hitler really came about, because it was not only a German project, but he was supported by the international oligarchy about whom we talk a lot. Among others, the grandfather of Bush and the boss of the Bank of England at the time, and others. It was a project of the oligarchy, and many people had read Mein Kampf and then knew when Hitler comes to power, there will be a war with Russia. And this fit perfectly in the plans of the British Empire. And of course, in 1945, all this was destroyed. But as we now know, for example, the Frankfurt School that emigrated to the US, it was in big parts was taken over by the CIA, and it came back for re-education, and that was not really that great, so that it produced big Democrats, but many Nazis were allowed back. And there was a Congress of Cultural Freedom, which systematically made a change of paradigm in the population. So, and destroy their connection to classical culture. And part of this was the modern music, 12-tone music. This was all part of this project. The first wave was this re-education. And that was from exile came politicians, handpicked, and the organic leaders who came out after World War II, who were really horrified by what had happened and wanted natural law to rule, so that something like that would never happen again. This was put to the side. And then instead of that, you had these people coming from abroad, put in leading positions. And so the structure which came about after World War II was under control of the occupying powers. There were exceptions. For example, Adenauer, he was an old fox who came through quite well, and other personalities. But basically, Germany was never sovereign. And in NATO, why is NATO good? To keep Russians out and the Germans down. And that was basically the secret of the post-war period. And 1989, the peaceful revolution, Germany fought its sovereignty. That should have happened in 1990. But as we have seen personally, it went differently. The Western politicians came with checkbooks and said, well, these people in Eastern Germany in the parties, we take them. And then, of course, Herrhausen and Rohrwedder were murdered. So it's a very long story how again and again in German politics there was interventions to have it not be sovereign. And now we have a government of Davos people, Davos puppets, a government which to a very large degree is dominated by oligarchical interest and American interest. So the question of sovereignty in Germany is extremely important. In Germany, the word sovereignists is not known in Germany. In other countries, you have a lot of people who are called sovereignists, but in Germany, this word doesn't even exist. So if we want to have a sovereign country and fight for it in Germany, the freedom wars from 1813 are not known today. This was another example where Germany was close to be a sovereign nation. So these are things. So all of this is a big subject. So these were just a few elements. General Delawarde, do you have any opinion on the situation in Germany? That would be also interesting to hear.
I am not very qualified to speak about Germany because I never served in Germany. I learned German language when I was a student, and I make some travel for leisure or for holidays in Germany, but I never had the opportunity to live a long period in Germany. But from outside, what I am observing is that since World War II, Germany is becoming old nation. The age of the people is increasing. Now, Germany, like France, and like a lot of European Union countries, are countries with a lot of old people inside, and I think the age of the population is important, because people which are older are more wise than the young people. They are not tempted to make war for anything. Normally, they should be wiser. What I think also about Germany, I used to have in foreign legion a lot of soldiers of the former Wehrmacht. They were much older than me, of course. I was a young lieutenant, and I think this kind of German that I knew were not at all the same kind that I see today. You know, the world with leisure, with the small family now, with one kid. I think Germany is not the Germany of 1933 or 36. Now it's a very different Germany. It's a Germany with a lot of German, but with also a lot of Turkish people, which immigrate in Germany, and gradually that change. The population of Germany has been changed in the last decades. So I cannot say if the Germany of today is much stronger, but I doubt that the Germany of today is as stronger as it was in 1940 or in 1939, you know. So what to say? In the military point of view, I think Germany is not ready at all to win a war alone. And even in the NATO environment, NATO today is a lot of armies which are almost dead. You know, French army, British army, German army, not very, very strong armies, because after 1990, after the collapse of Soviet Union, the European armies have stopped their budget, divided their budget by 3, divided their personnel by 3, and they cannot afford now to have powerful armies. You know, we have very few major equipment, because that costs a lot of money, and we have no budget to buy new ones, and we have no budget to maintain these sophisticated weapons or equipment. So now we are not ready for war. You know, we are not. Honestly, we will lose a classic war against Russia. NATO is not able to make war. So I let.
Yeah, if I could interject here, I think this raises a very fundamental question. If Russia has designs on Europe, if Putin is going to seize the Baltic states or Poland or Ukraine, why is it that Britain, France, Germany, Italy, why did they not prepare for this? It almost seems as though once the Soviet Union fell apart, the danger disappeared. Oh, were they unrealistic? No, the danger did disappear. The Soviet Union did fall apart. The Russian army was worth nothing. So when the Soviet Union disappeared, what about NATO? Well, NATO, of course, was an alliance designed to meet the threat of a very strong Russia and Warsaw Pact. Why didn't it disappear? Well, therein lies the solution here. The answer to the question is because people who profiteer on making and selling arms need an enemy, for God's sake. I mean, it's really pretty simple. How can you justify buying a modern Central European, all European battle tank if there's no enemy? You can't. So the Ukraine fiasco was a godsend to the Raytheons, the Lockheeds, the Northrop Grummons of this world. And they actually rejoiced. So therein lies the problem. If people tell you, well, you know, if the Russians succeed in Ukraine, the Baltic states would be next, and Poland. Have you been in the Baltic states? I have. What would the Russians want to go into the Baltic states for? So all I'm saying is the proof is in the pudding. Most of the sensible West realize there's no threat from Russia. That's why NATO is powerless now to meet the Russian advance in Ukraine. Now, why the Russian advance in Ukraine? Because the Russians didn't want a bulwark from NATO on their border with offensive missiles of the kind Khrushchev put in Cuba. It's very simple. Putin doesn't want to have just 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether this is a real attack on Russia and whether he should destroy the rest of the world. It's that simple, okay? So don't believe the people in this world that say, you know, this is just the first thing. It's sort of like the domino effect in Vietnam, right? The dominoes are going to all fall. Well, the dominoes didn't fall. It was a different situation there. The dominoes won't fall here either. Russia just wants some sensible guarantee that its security is respected, and that guarantee has to come with some resistance, some confession that we will not deploy offensive strike missiles on its border. One last thing here, for those of you who have not tuned into earlier seminars of this kind, President Biden was surprised at the end of last year, the end of 2021, he was surprised when he and Putin had agreed earlier in December of 2021 that there would be negotiations in Geneva to address the questions and concerns Russia had. He was really confused when the Kremlin called the White House and said, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden now. And I said, why now? Our negotiators are meeting in Geneva in less than 2 weeks, 9th and 10th of January. Why now? Please, now. Well, we have the readout from that conversation, 30 December. And what the Russian readout says, and it has not been contradicted by anyone, says Mr. Biden said that Washington has no intention to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. What does that mean? That means the negotiations are off to a really good start. That's what Putin is afraid of. These holes that already exist in Romania and Poland, none in Ukraine. What happened? Biden reneged, and I can prove it. 6 weeks later, the next summit, the readout was this subject of offensive strike missiles in Ukraine and not putting them there was not discussed. It's off the table. 2 weeks after that, the Russians invaded Ukraine. So this is all kind of, you have to kind of logically realize that Russia poses no threat to the rest of Europe. To Ukraine, well, only insofar as NATO and the US wants to put offensive strike missiles there and to keep bombing Russian-speaking nationals in Donetsk. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. And that is the reason, in my view, for this invasion of Ukraine. I hope it doesn't go south. I hope that the West will not try to rehabilitate their military capability, but we'll have to see, because as Putin has suggested, this is a West that has decided to take on China as well as Russia, and there's no clever subterfuge here. It's just crazy.
Unfortunately, I was out for the last 10 minutes because of a technical problem, but I think the discussion was really extremely fruitful and exciting. And formally, we're now at the end of our meeting after 3 hours. And I think we will absolutely continue these conferences. And I would like to ask Helga who has done this invitation on a short notice and on these what Merkel and Hollande said, but I want to give her the chance now to do say some last words and give us some advice and ideas. I think the danger is immense. I hope the military people who said that things will work out by themselves, but I would rather have a big mobilization and find other alternatives on the table. NATO is since 1981 obsolete, but it's trying to do havoc in the world. And therefore, we really need this international security architecture. The Peace of Westphalia is a model. After 150 years of religious wars in Europe, people recognize that doing the same for long more would kill everyone. And this is even more true today. Xi Jinping proposed a global security initiative, always in connection with a global development initiative. So for the Chinese, it's also the idea that security and development have to go together. And if we don't want a collapse of the West, which I see absolutely, we're on a powder keg. The central banks are between Schiller and Charybdis, quantitative easing, more inflation, quantitative tightening against inflation. So the danger of a big chain reaction collapse could any moment happen. That would make, in my opinion, the war danger even more acute, because there's a danger that these forces who want this war now because they make money out of it, that I don't think the West would dissolve as peacefully as the Soviet Union did. And the moment of biggest war danger is at the point when the economic difficulties of the West are maximum. And this can get totally out of control. It would be really wrong to think we have everything under control. So I ask all of you, even if we're not on the same line on everything, for example, on the Vatican, but we need a rallying institution where all concerned people who are for world peace, who can get together. And if you have a better person than the Pope who could be that, bring that into the discussion, I think we have to get together all these initiatives. For example, Lula, and also the president of East Timor proposed that Lula be a mediator, and there are other developing countries are supporting this. I find that they're very good. Erdogan did already in spring some mediation between Ukraine and Russia, until Boris Johnson came in suddenly in Kiev and said, we stopped that immediately. So Boris Johnson will be in history as a person who destroyed this peace process. And I could say a lot more about the British. So I ask all of you, if in this discussion you find something that motivates you to sign that open letter to the Pope and join us in our future planned peace initiatives, join us. So beginning of February, probably 4th or 5th of February, we'll have a big international conference of the Schiller Institute on the same subject, but also a lot on solutions. We plan many initiatives on February 19. So if you want to join, then do it. We need lots and lots of people who help us to make the world a safer place than it is today. And I would like to thank very much all the speakers, Ray, Scott, General Lagarde, and Colonel Corvez. And I ask you all, stay on board, fight with us, together with us. So, and then we will have good chances to produce a wonder, a miracle. I thank all speakers for their valuable contributions, and we are getting a lot of from the internet, a lot of positive comments, and among others from Russians. So maybe we can have some of them in the next time. And the conference of the Schiller Institute will be on February 4th and 5th. It will be online, and you will find details on the website schillerinstitute.com. And so register soon and use the time until then to be part of the mobilization so that humanity has a future. Thank you, everyone.